The cold was a uniform the mountain wore. It seeped through the soles of Rowan's boots, a slow, invasive chill that felt less like weather and more like a warning. He moved through the lodgepole pines with a silence learned in places far from this granite silence. His breath plumed in the thin air, a temporary ghost against the deep green and gray. The only sounds were the scuff of his boots on needle-strewn earth and the whisper of wind through the high branches, a sound like distant, unspooling static. He carried his past the way he carried his pack, a familiar weight adjusted for a long haul. His hands, shoved into the pockets of an olive field jacket worn soft at the elbows, were rough and calloused around scars he no longer saw. The jacket smelled of pine resin, gunmetal, and a faint, lingering trace of wood smoke from his cabin. He scanned the terrain not as a hiker, but as a man expecting an ambush. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, took in the broken lines of rockfall, the unnatural darkness of a hollow, the way the light fell through the canopy. It was a habit he could not break, a form of prayer for a man who had forgotten the words. 10 feet ahead and slightly to his left, the dog moved. Bodhi was a German shepherd of black and tan, built of lean muscle and disciplined energy. He was not a pet, he was a partner, retired but never truly off duty. His paws made almost no sound on the damp ground. His tail was held low and straight, a barometer of the world's pressure. He did not sniff idly or chase the scent of squirrels. His head was up, his dark, intelligent eyes scanning, his ears twitching to catch sounds Rowan's human senses would miss. Their relationship was a language of shared silence, of posture and position. A glance from Rowan was a command. A shift in Bodhi's weight was a report. For 2 years, this had been their routine. They walked the old logging trails that webbed the national forest, a patrol with no objective beyond movement itself. It was a way to keep the ghosts at bay, the ones that crowded him in the stillness of his small cabin. The memories waited in the quiet, smelling of ozone and cordite and the metallic tang of blood. Out here, in the cold and the wind, they kept a respectful distance. He checked the trails, cleared deadfall, reported washouts to the ranger station. It was work that felt like penance, simple, physical, honest. They came to a rise overlooking a deep, shadowed ravine. The air changed. The scent of pine and wet earth was cut by something else, something sharp and wrong, acrid. The smell of spilled fuel and hot metal gone cold. Rowan stopped. Bodhi had already frozen. He stood with one paw lifted, his body a straight, tense line from nose to tail. It was not the posture for a bear or a mountain lion. That was a low, solid stance. This was different. This was a posture of alert, of unnatural discovery. His head was cocked, his ears locked forward. He did not growl, he did not bark. He simply held his position, a living signpost pointing toward the wrongness. "Easy, boy," Rowan murmured, his voice a low rumble that was more vibration than sound. He rested a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the tight coil of muscle beneath the dense fur. Bodhi's warmth was a small anchor in the spreading cold of the ravine. The dog's gaze did not waver. He was looking down, into the place where the shadows were thickest. Rowan followed his line of sight. At first, he saw nothing but a jumble of shattered rock and splintered trees, the aftermath of an old avalanche. But Bodhi's focus was too precise. Rowan narrowed his eyes, letting the patterns resolve. And then he saw it. A glint of metal where no metal should be. A slash of faded blue against the gray stone. A shape that was too geometric, too clean in its ruin. It was a wreck, a small aircraft, wedged into the granite teeth of the ravine, its fuselage torn open like a can. Rust spread across the exposed aluminum like a wound that refused to scab, but the color was too bright for an old crash. This was not decades old. This was newer. The silence of the forest pressed in, suddenly heavier. This was a place secrets came to die. The mountain wore its silence like a uniform, and he had just found a tear in the fabric. Bodhi took a single, deliberate step forward, then looked back at Rowan, his eyes asking a question Rowan already knew the answer to. They were going down. The descent was slow, a controlled slide down scree and loose soil. Rowan moved with an economy of motion, testing each foothold before committing his weight. Bodhi navigated the treacherous slope with a low, four-legged grace, his claws finding purchase where Rowan's boots slipped. The smell grew stronger as they dropped into the ravine's cold pocket. Jet fuel, faint but unmistakable, and the damp, metallic scent of old rust and decay. But underneath it, something else. The sterile, clean scent of antiseptic. The wreck watched them the way old debts watch from across a room. It was a single-engine prop plane, a Cessna, its wings sheared off and crumpled against the ravine walls. The cockpit was a tangle of wires and shattered plexiglass. The fuselage had been ripped open just behind the main cabin, a violent, gaping mouth. Rowan circled it slowly, Bodhi at his heel, a silent, dark shadow. The dog's nose was working, twitching, sorting the complex layers of scent. This wasn't a simple crash. The straps on the cargo pallets stacked near the tail section had been cut cleanly, not frayed or snapped by impact. The supplies inside, medical kits, freeze-dried food, water purification tablets, were stacked neatly against the rock wall, covered by a tattered piece of the plane's fuselage. Someone had survived. Someone had stayed here. Someone had planned. Rowan ran a gloved hand over the stacked boxes. They were military grade, the same kind he'd packed and unpacked 1,000 times. He felt a low hum of unease in his chest, a frequency he recognized from a life he'd tried to bury. He moved toward the cockpit, his boots crunching on shattered glass. The instrument panel was a ruin, but the seats, the harnesses were unbuckled. Not cut, not broken, unbuckled. Bodhi whined, a low, tense sound. He was standing near the torn opening of the fuselage, his nose pressed to the metal edge. He looked back at Rowan, then back to the opening. He was refusing to go inside. "What is it?" Rowan asked, his voice quiet. He trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. Bodhi's senses were cleaner, unburdened by memory or guilt. Rowan crouched, peering into the dark interior. The smell was stronger here. Fuel, metal, and something else. Something that tugged at a wire deep in his brain. The scent of damp canvas and stale, recycled air. He crawled inside, the torn metal scraping against his jacket. The space was cramped, filled with shadows. A single beam of light from the tear in the roof illuminated a swirl of dust motes, and in that light, he saw the marks on the interior wall. Scratches. A calendar, tallied in groups of 5. 37 days. Below it, a single word was gouged into the aluminum paneling. Ghost. The air in his lungs turned to ice, the smell, the confined space, the metallic tang. The world tilted, the ravine disappearing, replaced by the suffocating darkness of a steel container on a listing cargo ship. The groan of stressed metal, the stink of diesel fumes, the cold sweat trickling down his spine. He was late. He was always too late. The door, when they finally cut it open, revealed only silence. Elias was gone. The handler who had taught him that a dog's loyalty was the only clean thing in a dirty world. A wet nose pressed hard against his cheek. A warm, solid weight leaned into his side, pulling him from the memory's undertow. Bodhi. The dog had overcome his reluctance and followed him in. He was pushing against Rowan, a firm, grounding pressure. His dark eyes were fixed on Rowan's, and for a moment, the gaze was not that of an animal, but of a partner, a witness. It landed on him with the weight of a hand on his shoulder. Rowan took a slow, shuddering breath. The cargo hold receded, replaced by the cold, damp reality of the wreck. He was here. Now. He nodded once, a silent thank you to the dog. His gaze fell back to the wall, to the scratched name. Ghost. That was the name of Elias Vance's K9, a silver-furred Belgian Malinois with eyes like chips of amber. Rowan had been told they died together in a training accident, a helicopter malfunction over a training range in Virginia. A story that had felt too neat, too clean. His eyes scanned the floor of the fuselage, now seeing it with new focus. He saw a scuffed patch of floor beneath a loose panel. He pried it up with the tip of his knife. Tucked inside the small compartment was a thin leather collar. Attached to it, a single metal tag. He picked it up. It was cold against his glove. He turned it over. The engraving was clear. K9, Ghost. 2, K9, V. The numbers and letters were a code he understood in his bones. K9 Unit. Handler, Vance. Elias. This tag did not belong here, in a crashed plane in the middle of a national forest in Wyoming. It belonged in a display case at Fort Bragg, or buried with the man who had been its other half. The official story was a lie. Elias had been here. He had survived for 37 days. He had waited, and no one had come. The same old story, the same old failure. Rowan closed his fist around the tag, the metal biting into his palm. He had not gone back for Elias on that ship. He had been ordered away. He had obeyed. He didn't go back. The artifact in his hand was not just a piece of metal. It was a summons. The past was not dead. It had just been waiting for him in the cold. He looked at Bodhi, who sat with a quiet, solemn stillness, as if he understood the weight of the discovery. The dog's gaze shifted from the tag in Rowan's hand to the scratched name on the wall. A low rumble started deep in his chest. Not a growl, not a warning. Recognition. The weight of the dog tag in his pocket was heavier than any stone. It was a link, a key, a question that demanded an answer. Elias Vance, a man Rowan had believed buried by military regulation and quiet grief, had been alive, here, for 37 days. The official report, the one delivered by a grim-faced officer in a starched uniform, had been a clean, efficient fiction. Training accident, no recovery possible, a closed casket and a flag folded with perfect, impersonal corners. Rowan had accepted it. In his world, truth was often a casualty, and neat stories were a form of mercy. He had mourned Elias in his own silent way, adding his name to a list he never spoke aloud. But this wreck, this crude calendar scratched into the fuselage, this dog tag, it tore that neat story to shreds. Elias hadn't died in a clean accident. He had died here, alone, in the cold heart of a mountain that kept its secrets well. Bodhi stayed close as they climbed out of the ravine, his body occasionally brushing against Rowan's leg. The dog seemed to sense the shift in him, the way the quiet of the woods was now filled with the screaming of unanswered questions. Rowan's hypervigilance was no longer a habit. It was a necessity. He was not just a veteran on a hike. He was the sole witness to a crime that had been buried for years. When they reached the ridge, Rowan paused, looking back down at the gash in the trees where the plane lay hidden. It was a grave, an unmarked one. He thought of Elias, a man who could read a dog's soul in the twitch of an ear, who spoke of loyalty as a sacred thing. He would not have crashed here by accident. He would not have been on this plane without a reason. As they walked the trail back toward the access road where he'd parked his truck, Bodhi suddenly stopped. He stood, alert, his gaze fixed on a point down the trail. A moment later, Rowan heard it too, the low rumble of an engine. Not the high whine of a tourist's rental car, but the familiar, throaty growl of a V8 that needed a new manifold gasket. A dusty blue Ford pickup, a classic from the late 70s, rolled to a stop beside Rowan's own vehicle. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man unfolded himself from the cab. Michael. He was tall and lean, with the quiet competence of someone who spent his days fixing things other people had broken. He wore a grease-stained work shirt with the name of his garage stitched over the pocket. His dark hair was shorter than Rowan remembered from their time in the service, but his eyes were the same, a calm, steady brown that took everything in without judgment. They hadn't spoken in 15 years. Not since the debriefing room, where they had both given their carefully curated statements about the mission that took Elias. They had gone their separate ways, two men carrying the same splinter of shrapnel in their memory. Rowan had run to the mountains. Michael had come home to the small Wyoming town he'd grown up in, just an hour's drive from where Rowan had chosen to disappear. Rowan had seen his truck around town, had known he was there, but he had kept his distance. Proximity felt like a risk. "Rowan," Michael said. It wasn't a question. His voice was the same, low and even. He held up a small, greasy cardboard box. "Your distributor cap came in. Figured I'd save you the trip." It was a simple act, an excuse. Rowan hadn't ordered a distributor cap, but his truck had been hesitating on cold starts, a fact he hadn't mentioned to anyone. Michael was a good mechanic. He noticed things. "Thanks," Rowan said, his own voice sounding rusty to his ears. He took the box. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. a spark of warmth against the cold air, a flicker of something that Rowan immediately walled off. He didn't examine it, he just noted it, like a change in the wind. Michael's gaze dropped to Bodhi, who stood between them, perfectly still. The dog was not guarding, not warning. He was just present, a bridge of silent understanding. "Heard you got out with a partner," Michael said, his eyes full of a soft respect for the dog. "Good-looking shepherd." "Bodhi," Rowan said. "He's retired." "We all are," Michael said, a statement of fact with no self-pity in it. His eyes came back to Rowan's face, and for a beat, the polite distance of strangers dissolved. He saw the tension in Rowan's jaw, the new depth of the lines around his eyes. Michael's gaze was steady, and in it, Rowan felt a flicker of recognition, an unspoken acknowledgement of the years and the weight they both carried. It was a look that said, "I see you. I remember." An ache, sharp and unfamiliar, bloomed in Rowan's chest. He quickly looked away toward the trees. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Michael said quietly, his gaze following Rowan's toward the forest. The words hit Rowan like a physical blow. He tightened his grip on the small box, the cardboard creasing under the pressure. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Michael seemed to understand he'd struck a nerve, though he couldn't know how precisely. He didn't press. He just leaned against the fender of his old truck, creating an atmosphere of patience. "Look, Rowan, I know we haven't, well, it's been a while, but I'm here. If you need anything, a tow, a tune-up, someone to stay." The offer hung in the air between them, the last part of it loaded with a meaning that was both entirely innocent and deeply resonant. Someone to stay. It was what Elias had needed. It was what Rowan had failed to be. "I'm fine," Rowan said, the automatic defense of a man who was anything but. Before Michael could respond, Bodhi shifted his weight. He took a step closer to Rowan and nudged the hand holding the dog tag in his pocket. Then he looked at Michael, a long, steady look. Bodhi had been a pup when Rowan and Michael were serving, a part of the unit's extended family before he was assigned. He had known Elias. He had known Ghost. And now, he sat down. He sat squarely on the dirt road, directly between the two men who had not spoken in 15 years. His posture a silent, unarguable declaration. He was not moving until they figured this out. He remembered. The first official call went to the ranger station. Rowan kept it simple, clinical. A downed aircraft, unregistered tail numbers from what he could see, located in the South Fork of the Granite Creek Ravine. He gave the coordinates. He mentioned evidence of long-term survival. He did not mention Elias Vance. He did not mention the dog tag. That was a truth he was holding close, a dangerous piece of heat in the cold landscape of the investigation he knew was coming. The voice on the other end was Sarah Jenkins. She was the district's lead ranger, a woman in her late 30s with a no-nonsense voice and a reputation for being sharper than the Forest Service issue axes. She knew Rowan, or at least knew of him. The quiet veteran who patrolled the backcountry with his shepherd, filing meticulous reports and asking for nothing. "You're sure about the survival signs, Rowan?" she asked, her tone all business. "Positive," he said. "Supplies were organized. Shelter was improved. Someone was there for weeks." "Okay," she said after a pause. "I'm notifying the county sheriff and the FAA. We'll head up at first light. Don't go back to the site. It's a federal investigation scene now." "Understood," he said, though he had no intention of staying away. By late afternoon, the institutional machinery began to grind into motion. A sheriff's deputy came to his cabin to take a preliminary statement. Rowan gave him the same spare facts. The deputy was young, chewing gum, more interested in Bodhi than in the details of the wreck. He wrote it all down in a small notebook and left. It felt procedural, dismissive. The real threat arrived just before dusk, not in a marked vehicle, but in a pristine black SUV that seemed to absorb the fading light. It crunched to a stop on the gravel drive, its engine purring with quiet, expensive power. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped out. He was in his 50s, with silvering hair combed perfectly into place, and a smile that was practiced and pleasant. It never reached his eyes. "Mr. Rowan?" he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, dry, and brief. "My name is Harris. I'm with Vanguard Logistics. We're the contractors handling the recovery of the aircraft you located. I just wanted to thank you personally for your civic-mindedness." Rowan didn't take the offered hand. He kept his arms crossed, a gesture that made him feel foolishly defensive, but was better than the alternative. Bodhi, who had been lying on the porch, rose to his feet in a single fluid motion. He didn't growl, but he stood with a rigid stillness, his body positioned slightly in front of Rowan, a living shield. "That was fast," Rowan said. Mr. Harris's smile didn't falter. "The FAA can be very efficient when dealing with proprietary corporate assets. Our company owned that aircraft. It was a transport flight, went down in a storm a few years back. Tragic accident. We're just here to manage the environmental cleanup and salvage." His language was smooth, corporate, designed to soothe and control. Every word was a lie. A few years back, the rust was fresh. The supplies were military grade. "There were signs someone survived," Rowan stated, watching the man's face for a flicker, a crack in the polite facade. There was none. "Yes, a terrible tragedy," Harris said, his voice dripping with synthetic empathy. "The pilot, he died on impact. We recovered his remains at the time. Any materials you saw must have been dislodged by animals over the years. It can be deceiving." Bodhi let out a low, guttural rumble, a sound that vibrated through the wooden planks of the porch. It was a controlled warning, the sound of a professional identifying a threat. Harris's eyes flickered to the dog, and for the first time, a hint of annoyance tightened the corners of his mouth. "Quite the watchdog you have there," he said. He took a small step back. "Look, Mr. Rowan, we appreciate your help, but from this point on, this is a private matter on federal land. The site is hazardous. We'll have teams securing the perimeter tonight. For your own safety and for liability reasons, it's best if you stay clear. We wouldn't want any local citizens getting hurt or facing charges for interfering with a federal recovery operation." The threat was implicit, wrapped in the language of concern, legal, professional, personal. This was not a random crash. It was organized. The speed of their arrival, the polished story, the veiled warning. It was a containment strategy. They weren't here to recover a wreck. They were here to bury it deeper. Just as Harris was turning to leave, another vehicle pulled in. It was a Forest Service truck, and Sarah Jenkins stepped out. She walked over, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. She nodded at Rowan, then looked at Harris. "Ma'am," Harris said, his pleasant mask slipping back into place. "Just briefing the citizen who found our property. We'll be coordinating with your office, of course." "Of course," Sarah said, her tone dry. She held out a data pad. "I'll need your permits, environmental impact assessment for the salvage operation, authorization from the FAA, and your land use agreement with the Forest Service." Harris's smile tightened. "My team in the office is handling the paperwork. It will all be forwarded to you in the morning." "I'll need it before any of your people set foot in that ravine," Sarah said, her voice calm but unyielding. "This is a protected wilderness area, Mr. Harris, and until the NTSB clears the site, it's a potential accident scene. My authority supersedes your corporate one here." She was providing support, building a wall of bureaucracy that even a man like Harris would have to respect. Harris held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills fought in the dying light. Finally, he gave a slight, formal nod. "We'll be in touch," he said. He got back into his black SUV and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled slowly in the cold air. Sarah turned to Rowan. "Vanguard Logistics," she said, her voice low. "They're not a salvage company. They're a private security contractor, defense contracts, transportation of sensitive materials. What did you really find down there, Rowan?" He looked from her determined face to the empty road where the SUV had disappeared. He felt the cold weight of the dog tag in his pocket. He was no longer just a man with a past. He was a loose end. And men like Harris were very good at tying them up. Sleep did not come. Rowan sat in the dark of his cabin, the only light from the embers glowing in the wood stove. He cleaned his rifle, the familiar, methodical movements a balm to his frayed nerves. The scent of solvent and oil filled the small room. Bodhi lay by the hearth, awake and watchful, his head on his paws but his eyes open, tracking Rowan's movements. The past and present had collapsed into a single, dangerous point. Elias, Vanguard Logistics, a plane crash that was not an accident, a survival that had been ignored. He felt the old, bitter taste of failure rising in his throat, the feeling of being one step behind, of arriving just in time to count the dead. He knew, with a certainty that settled like ice in his gut, that Harris's team would not wait for permits. They would move under the cover of darkness. They were not a cleanup crew, they were a sanitation crew. Before the first hint of dawn, he was up. He pulled on his boots, shrugged into his jacket, and grabbed a small pack with a headlamp and a flask of coffee. Bodhi was waiting by the door, his tail giving a single, tight wag. Rowan didn't need to give a command. The dog knew. They moved through the pre-dawn gloom, taking a less traveled route to the ravine, a game trail that was harder to track. The air was still and frigid. As they neared the ridge, Rowan smelled it. Not fuel this time. Ammonia. A sharp, chemical scent used to bleach and sterilize. Bodhi sneezed, shaking his head, a clear signal of chemical interference. They crested the ridge and looked down. It was worse than he'd imagined. The site was swarming with figures in dark coveralls, moving with quiet, disciplined efficiency under the harsh glare of portable floodlights. They were cutting the fuselage into sections with plasma torches, the sparks arcing brightly in the darkness. The neat stack of supplies was gone. The personal effects were gone. They were erasing the wreck, scrubbing the mountain clean of its memory. Evidence was being stolen, destroyed. He was too late. Again. A wave of cold fury washed over him, followed by the hollow echo of despair. He had seen this before. The quiet, efficient removal of inconvenient truths. He watched for a few minutes more, a ghost on the ridge, then turned and melted back into the trees. There was nothing he could do. They were a team. He was one man and a dog. He got back to his cabin as the sun was rising, casting long, pale fingers of light across the valley. He called Sarah Jenkins. "They're already there," he said, his voice flat. "They're cutting it up." Her sigh was heavy with frustration. "I just got off the phone with my supervisor. He got a call from a senator's office. Vanguard has friends in high places. My hands are tied, Rowan. They're claiming national security exemption on the cargo. The official story is now that it was a classified drone that went down. They've backdated the flight plan. You and I are being told we saw nothing. Discredited, isolated. The system was working exactly as designed. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating. He hung up the phone without another word. The cabin, once his sanctuary, felt like a cage. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was mocking. It was filled with the ghost of Elias Vance, asking why he had been left to die. Again. He pulled a bottle of whiskey from the back of a cupboard, the one he kept for injuries, not for drinking. He broke the seal and poured a measure into a glass, the amber liquid catching the morning light. The smell was sharp, promising a dull, warm oblivion. He stared at it, the reflection of his own tired face wavering on the surface. This was the retreat, the foxhole of guilt and isolation he had dug for himself years ago. He was an expert at it. He pushed people away. He didn't answer the knock on his door late that morning, knowing it was probably Michael, come to check on him. He let the phone ring when Sarah called again, her name flashing on the screen. He pulled the curtains, shutting out the world. The wound from that mission 15 years ago, the one that had cost Elias his life the first time, tore open. The guilt was no longer a dull ache. It was a raw, gaping void. He had failed then, and he had failed now. He was good at finding the lost. He was terrible at saving them. He sat in his worn armchair, the glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him, and let the darkness take him. He didn't fight it. He was tired of fighting. Hours passed. The light outside shifted from morning gold to the flat gray of afternoon. The fire in the stove died down to pale ashes. The cabin grew cold. Through it all, Bodhi did not leave his side. He didn't whine or nudge or demand. He simply moved from the hearth and lay down on the floor next to Rowan's chair, his body a warm, solid presence in the cold room. At some point, he rested his heavy head on Rowan's boot. He did not react to Rowan's anger, his silence, or his withdrawal. He simply stayed, present, patient, unshakable. Rowan looked down at the dog. Bodhi's dark eyes were fixed on him, not with judgment, but with a deep, unwavering loyalty that Rowan knew he did not deserve. The dog's steady breathing was the only sound in the room, a quiet rhythm of life in the face of Rowan's surrender. It was a tether, a thin, strong line holding him to the present. The dog stayed. It was the simplest and most profound act of faith Rowan had ever witnessed. He would not let him drift away alone. Slowly, deliberately, Rowan reached down and placed his hand on the dog's broad head. The fur was warm, real. The whiskey remained on the table, its promise of oblivion now seeming cheap and empty. The dog had stayed, and because he had stayed, Rowan knew he had to as well. The choice to stay was not a lightning strike of resolve, but a slow, grudging turn, like a great ship coming about in a heavy sea. It began with a single act, pushing the untouched glass of whiskey away. Rowan stood, his joints stiff from hours of sitting, and walked to the door. He opened it, letting the cold, clean air flood the stale cabin. Bodhi rose and stood beside him, looking out at the mountains as if to say, "What's next?" "I don't know," Rowan said aloud, "but we're not done." He knew going back to the ravine now would be useless. Harris's crew would have scrubbed it down to the bedrock. The evidence they had left behind would be microscopic, circumstantial, not enough to fight a corporation with senators on speed dial. He needed something they had missed, something they didn't know existed. That evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Bodhi became agitated. He paced the cabin, whining softly, going to the door and looking back at Rowan. It was not his usual request for a final walk. It was insistent, purposeful. "What is it, boy?" Rowan asked, kneeling down to look the dog in the eye. Bodhi nudged Rowan's hand, then walked to the small table where Rowan had emptied his pockets the day before. Among the keys, the knife, and loose change lay the leather collar and the single, cold tag. Canine Ghost. Bodhi nudged it with his nose, then looked back at Rowan, his gaze intense. Then he walked back to the door. He wanted to go back. Not just to the woods, but to the sight. A sliver of hope, sharp and painful, pierced through Rowan's exhaustion. The dog remembered something. Not just a place, but a detail. Trust the dog. It was the first rule Elias had ever taught him. They set out under the cover of a moonless night, two shadows moving through a forest of ghosts. Rowan wore a headlamp with a red filter, enough to see by, but not enough to be seen from a distance. He followed Bodhi, letting the dog lead. Bodhi did not take him to the main crash site. He skirted it, his nose to the ground, moving with a certainty that electrified the air. He led Rowan 100 yards up the opposite side of the ravine, to a dense thicket of firs and a massive rockfall. The place was a chaotic jumble of stone and splintered timber, untouched by the cleanup crew. Bodhi stopped at the base of a huge, moss-covered boulder. He began to dig, his paws sending dirt and pine needles flying. He was frantic, obsessed. "Easy," Rowan said, placing a hand on his back. He pulled a small entrenching tool from his pack and began to help, clearing the rocks and roots the dog had exposed. After 10 minutes of digging, the shovel hit something hard and flat. Not rock. Plastic. Rowan cleared the remaining dirt away with his hands. It was a Pelican case. A small, black, waterproof box, the kind used to protect sensitive electronics. It had been deliberately buried, wedged deep beneath the root system of an ancient tree that had been uprooted by the crash. Vance. He must have been thrown clear, or crawled away from the main wreckage. He had known they might come for the plane. He had made a backup, a dead man's switch. He carried the case back to his cabin, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pried it open. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was a small, ruggedized flight data recorder and a thin, leather-bound logbook. Rowan opened the book. The first page was dated 6 weeks before the crash. The handwriting was Elias Vance's, a tight, precise script. It was not a personal journal. It was a record of evidence. Vance, working as a K9 handler for Vanguard Logistics, had discovered the company was using its government contracts as a cover. They were not transporting sensitive materials. They were transporting and illegally dumping hazardous waste, chemical, biological, radiological, in remote locations across the country, under the guise of classified missions. The flight logs, the cargo manifests he'd copied, the chemical signatures he'd sampled, It was all there. The final entry was written in a shaky hand. They know. Cole, the pilot, is with me. We have the master drive. Taking the bird. If we don't make it, Ghost has the trail. Ghost has the trail. Elias had trusted his partner to the very end. He must have attached a scent marker to the case, something only a trained canine would recognize. A scent that had lingered for years, waiting for the right nose to find it. Bodie, who had trained with Vance and Ghost, had found it. The next morning, Rowan called Sarah Jenkins. "Meet me at the diner in town," he said. "Don't come to my place. Come alone." She was there in 20 minutes, sitting in a booth with 2 cups of coffee already on the table. Rowan slid in opposite her and pushed the logbook across the table. He said nothing. He watched her face as she read. He saw her professional skepticism melt into dawning horror, then harden into cold fury. "This is explosive," she whispered, her eyes wide. "This is enough to burn them to the ground." "They buried it once," Rowan said. "They'll try to bury it again. They'll say it's a forgery. They'll say I'm an unstable, disgruntled vet with a grudge." "Not if we have the data recorder," she said. "I have a friend at the NTSB, someone I trust. He can analyze it off the books. But we need to be careful, Rowan. They're dangerous." As she spoke, the bell over the diner door jingled. Michael walked in. He saw Rowan and Sarah in the booth, the intense look on their faces, the book on the table between them. He didn't approach. He just went to the counter, ordered a coffee to go, and then, instead of leaving, he took a seat at the counter, his back to them but clearly visible in the reflection of the window. He just sat there, nursing his coffee, standing watch. A quiet, unobtrusive sentinel. The community, Rowan realized, was not just the official channels. It was the ranger who bent the rules because she trusted her gut. It was the quiet mechanic who showed up without being asked. Small alliances, built on character, not on protocol. Over the next 48 hours, a quiet network of resistance formed. Sarah got the recorder to her contact. The data corroborated every word in Vance's logbook. A local journalist, a friend of Sarah's who owed her a favor, began quietly investigating Vanguard's other environmental cleanup sites, finding patterns of contamination and illness in nearby communities. People started talking. Old stories of strange convoys in the night, of chemical smells on the wind, of livestock getting sick. The official silence began to fracture. The exposure was not a single explosion, but a series of small, controlled detonations. Testimony, documentation, community refusal to stay silent. It was not a battle fought with weapons, but with truth. The day the story broke, a preliminary injunction was filed against Vanguard, freezing all their domestic operations. Federal marshals raided their headquarters. Mr. Harris was not arrested, not yet. He was, the news said, cooperating with investigators. But his system, the one built on polite lies and institutional power, was exposed. That evening, Rowan was sitting on his porch, watching the last light fade from the mountains. Bodie was asleep at his feet. A familiar truck rumbled up the drive. Michael got out, walked up the steps, and sat on the top step near Rowan's chair. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the breathing of the dog. "He was a good man, Elias," Michael said finally, his voice soft. "The best," Rowan agreed. Michael looked at Rowan, his face half in shadow. "You did right by him, Rowan. You stayed." The words were simple, but they landed with the force of a benediction. Rowan just nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. Michael reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a casual pat. It was a firm, grounding pressure, a silent communication of shared history, shared grief, and a profound, unspoken gratitude. He held it there a beat longer than necessary, a moment of quiet communion, before giving a gentle squeeze and letting go. It was an exhalation, a release of a weight Rowan hadn't even realized he was still bracing against. In that one gesture, 15 years of silence were bridged. The crisis was over, but the world was not saved. Vanguard Logistics was tangled in a web of lawsuits and federal investigations that would take years to unravel. Mr. Harris disappeared into the labyrinth of corporate law, a ghost in a suit who would likely never see the inside of a courtroom. The change was not a revolution. It was incremental, honest, imperfect. The hazardous waste was still out there, buried in the quiet places. But now, people knew where to look. A map had been drawn by a dead man. The truth about Elias Vance came out. His official record was amended. He was no longer a casualty of a training accident, but a whistleblower killed in the line of a different kind of duty. A small memorial plaque was placed at the trailhead near the ravine, honoring him and his canine partner, Ghost. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. It was a story set right. Rowan did not leave. The urge to run, to find a new mountain, a new silence, had faded. The quiet in his cabin no longer felt like an accusation. He had answered the summons. He had stayed. He still checked the trails, but now he also checked in with Sarah Jenkins, sharing coffee and information. He stopped by Michael's garage, not because his truck needed fixing, but just to talk. He was still scarred, still carried the weight of his past, but he was no longer carrying it alone. He had chosen to remain, to be a part of the small, fierce community that had refused to look away. One afternoon, a week after the story broke, he was sitting on his porch. The air was crisp, hinting at the coming autumn. He was cleaning a piece of tack, his hands moving with slow, deliberate purpose. The leather smelled of oil and use. He was not scanning the horizon for threats. He was simply present in his own life. He had stopped running. Bodhi lay in a patch of afternoon sun, his body completely relaxed. He was not on watch. He was not on alert. His paws twitched occasionally as he dreamed, chasing rabbits in a field free of ghosts and chemical scents. His breathing was deep and even. He was at peace, his work for this story done. His loyalty had been a compass needle, pointing the way back not just to a hidden truth, but to Rowan himself. The dog rested. It is a profound truth that the most loyal among us often carry the quietest burdens. They stand watch while we sleep. They absorb our anger and our grief without complaint, and they offer their presence as a shield against the darkness. We look for God in the thunder and the whirlwind, in the grand pronouncements and the dramatic interventions. But perhaps the divine is more often found in the quiet fidelity of a dog who lays his head on your boot when the world has gone cold. Perhaps it is in the steady presence of a friend who sits with you in the silence, offering no solutions, only company. The world is full of broken things, of buried truths and convenient lies, and we are often tempted to turn away, to seek our own quiet corner and let the darkness have its due. But we are called to something more. We are called to stay, to be the one who notices, to be the one who speaks up, to be the one who stands with those who are afraid. We are not asked to be perfect, only to be present. We are not asked to win every battle, only to hold the line with courage and with love. Sometimes the most sacred ground is not a cathedral, but a patch of sun on a wooden porch where a good dog sleeps, his duty done. Sometimes the most powerful prayer is not a litany of words, but the simple, unshakable choice to stay.